The Ara Pacis Augusta is an altar in Rome dedicated to Pax, the Roman goddess of peace. The monument was commissioned by the Roman Senate on July 4, 13 BC to honor the return of Augustus to Rome after 3 years in Hispania and Gaul, and consecrated on January 30, 09 BC. The altar reflects the Augustan vision of Roman civil religion. The Ara Pacis is perhaps best known for the decoration on the exterior of the precinct walls, composed of 2 tiers of friezes. On the north and south, the upper register depicts the procession of members of the imperial household and the larger regime, while on the east and west panels depict allegorical themes of peace and Roman civic ritual. The lower register of the frieze depicts vegetal work meant to communicate the abundance and prosperity of the Roman peace. The monument as a whole serves a civic ritual function while simultaneously operating as propaganda for Augustus and his regime, raising notions of autocracy and dynastic succession that might otherwise be unpalatable to traditional Roman culture. The altar was originally located on the northern outskirts of Rome, a Roman mile from the boundary of the Pomerium on the west side of the Via Flaminia. It stood in the northeastern corner of the Campus Martius, the former floodplain of the Tiber River, which was developed by Augustus into a complex of monuments. In succeeding centuries, the monument gradually became buried under 4 meters of silt deposits, although parts of it were recovered and restored, with limited accuracy, as early as the Renaissance. The vast majority of the Ara Pacis was recovered in the 20th century. It was reassembled in its current location in 1938. The altar, the Ara Pacis, stood within an enclosure that is elaborately and finely sculpted entirely in lunar marble. Within the enclosing precinct walls, the altar itself was carved with images illustrating the lex aria, the law governing the ritual performed at the altar. The sacrificial procession depicts animals being led to sacrifice by figures carved in a Republican style similar to the so-called altar of Domitius, a Hanno-Barbus, in sharp contrast with the style on the exterior of the precinct walls. What remains of the altar is otherwise fragmentary, but it appears to have been largely functional with less emphasis on art and decoration. The interior of the precinct walls are carved with bucrania, ox skulls, from which carved garlands hang. The garlands bear fruits from various types of plants, all displayed on a single garland as allegorical representations of plenty and abundance. The bucrania in turn evoke the idea of sacrificial piety, appropriate motifs for the interior of the altar precinct. The lower register of the interior walls imitate the appearance of traditionally wooden altar precincts, which were meant to bring to mind other such altars in Rome and the tradition of constructing altars at the boundary of the city's Pomerium. Exterior wall decoration. The exterior walls of the Ara Pacis are divided between allegorical and pseudo-historical relief panels on the upper register, while the lower register is compared of scenes of nature, harmonic, intertwined vines that contain wildlife and connote nature under control. The upper register of the northern and southern walls depict scenes of the emperor, his family, and members of the regime in the act of processing or performing a sacrifice. Various togate figures are shown with their heads covered, signifying their role as both priests and sacrificiants. Other figures wear laurel crowns, traditional Roman symbols of victory. Members of individual priestly colleges are depicted in traditional garb appropriate to their office, while lictors can be identified by their iconographic fasces. Women and children are also included among the procession. The depiction of children in Roman sculpture would have been novel at the time of the altar's construction, evoking themes of moral and familial piety, as well as easing concerns over dynastic tensions while simultaneously introducing potential heirs to the public eye. The western and eastern walls are both perceived by entryways to the altar, although the interior would only have been accessed by a stairway on the western side. The entryways were flanked by panels depicting allegorical or mythological scenes evocative of peace, piety, and tradition. On the eastern wall, panels depicted the seated figures of Roma and Pax, while the western side depicts the discovery of the twins and she-wolf and the sacrifice of a figure traditionally identified as Aeneas, but increasingly believed to be Rome's second king, Numa Pompilius. The identity of these various figures has been a point of some controversy over the years, relying heavily on interpretation of fragmentary remains. Discussed below. The sculpture of the Ara Pacis is primarily symbolic rather than decorative, and its iconography has several levels of significance. Studies of the Ara Pacis and similar public Roman monuments traditionally address the potent political symbolism of their decorative programs, and their emphasis and promulgation of dynastic and other imperial policies. They are usually studied as a form of imperial propaganda. The Ara Pacis is seen to embody without conscious effort the deep-rooted ideological connections among cosmic sovereignty, military force, and fertility that were first outlined by Georges Dumézil. Connections which are attested in early Roman culture and more broadly in the substructure of Indo-European culture at large. It has been suggested by Peter Holiday that the altar's imagery of the Golden Age, usually discussed as mere poetic illusion, appealed to a significant component of the Roman populace. The program of the Ara Pacis addressed this group's very real fears of cyclical history, and promised that the rule of Augustus would avert the cataclysmic destruction of the world predicted by contemporary models of historical thought. The figures, the long friezes of the Ara Pacis, contain figures advancing towards the west, who participate in a state of thanksgiving to celebrate the peace created by Augustus. These figures fall into four categories: lictors, priests, women and children, and attendants. In addition, there are 2 or 3 non-Roman children, who may be guests in Rome. Their identification by their non-Roman costume and their participation in the ceremony advertises to all that Rome is the center of the world, and that other nations send their young to Rome to learn Roman ways, so great is Rome's reputation. The ceremony took place in the summer of 13 BC, but not necessarily on the 4th of July, when the Senate voted to build the Ara Pacis. The east and west walls each contain 2 panels, one well-preserved and one represented only in fragments. The east wall contains a badly preserved scene of a female warrior, possibly Roma, apparently sitting on a pile of weapons confiscated from the enemy, thus forcing peace upon them by rendering them unable to make war. This scene has been reconstructed, based on coins that depict such a seated Roma. When the monument was being reconstructed at its present site, Edmund Buckner and other scholars sketched what the panel may have looked like. This interpretation, although widely accepted, cannot be proved correct, as so little of the original panel survives. The other panel is more controversial in its subject, but far better preserved. A goddess sits amid a scene of fertility and prosperity with twins on her lap. Scholars have variously suggested that the goddess is Italia, Tellus, Venus, and Peace, although the views also circulate. Due to the widespread depiction around the sculpture of scenes of peace, and because the altar is named for peace, the favored conclusion is that the goddess is Pax. The west wall also contains 2 panels. The fragmentary, Lupercal panel, apparently preserves the moment when Romulus and Remus were discovered by Faustulus the shepherd, while Mars looks on. Again, this panel is a modern drawing without much evidence. Marble fragments of the tree and the head and shoulder of Mars and part of a second individual survive, but the addition of the she-wolf, Romulus, and Remus is entirely speculative. The better preserved scene depicts the sacrifice of a pig by an old priest and 2 attendants. In 1907, this scene was identified by Johannes Sivking as the moment when Aeneas, newly arrived in Italy, sacrificed Tasso and her 30 piglets to Juno, as told by Virgil and others, even though the scene differs greatly from Virgil's description. In the 1960s, Stefan Weinstock challenged this identification, citing numerous discrepancies that Sivking and his followers had failed to notice between Virgil's version and the panel. Subsequently, the suggestion was made that the scene shows Numa Pompilius, the Roman king associated with peace and the gates of Janus. Paul Rehak later published an article with this proposal, confirmed in a chapter of his posthumous book. This theory has won over many scholars, despite considerable initial resistance. North Wall. The North Wall has about 46 extant or partially extant figures. The first two foreground figures are lictors, carrying fasces. The next set of figures consists of priests from the College of the Septemviri Epaulones, so identified by an incense box they carry with special symbols. One member of this college is missing in a gap. After them follows the Collegium of the Quindecimviri Sacris Faciendis, also identified by the incense box carried by a public slave among them. Although the name suggests this college has exactly 15 members, the size of the college has grown to 23, including Augustus and Agrippa, who appear on the south frieze. The other 21 members are present here. Two very badly damaged figures in the middle are split by a gap. From photos, the gap appears to affect a single figure, but as Coepel, Conline, and Stern have proven, in-situ examination reveals that one is a foreground and the other a background figure. The last portion of the north frieze consists of members of the imperial family. Many scholars used to identify the veiled, leading figure as Julia, daughter of Augustus, but since Julia appears on the south frieze, it is more likely that this figure is Octavia Minor. Other figures in the entourage might include Marcella, Iulus Antonius, and two boys and a girl of the imperial family. In 1894, and again in 1902 and 1903, Eugen Peterson suggested that Lucius Caesar appears with Agrippa, dressed in a Trojan costume for the Troy game held in 13 BC. Many scholars, realizing by 1935 that Lucius was too young to be the boy beside Agrippa, preferred to identify him as Gaius. They named the smallest child on the north frieze Lucius, even though he is a mere toddler. Some scholars assumed this boy also was a participant in the Troy Games, although he is certainly too young. If this toddler were Lucius, he would be too young and in the wrong costume for the Troy Games. The best guess is that he is a Germanic tribal prince, but he is certainly not addressed as a Trojan. As Charles Bryan Rose has noted, the variable value of the Eastern costume and the uneasy interaction of Trojan and Parthian iconography can make it difficult to determine whether one is viewing the founders of the Romans or their fiercest opponents. The youth wearing Hellenistic Greek clothing suited to a Hellenistic prince has been identified as Gaius in the guise of a Camillus, an adolescent attendant of the Flamengdialus. The Gaius identification is best supported by his size. However, an additional boy in Roman dress who has a bulla is also the right size, and therefore a better guess. For Gaius to appear in public without his bulla would invite the evil eye. This same figure in Hellenistic dress has also been interpreted as Ptolemy of Mauritania representing Africa, along with the German boy and the Parthian prince. A foreign prince would not wear a bulla. South Wall. The South Wall has seen a great deal of scholarship and the greatest number of academic debates. Unlike the North Wall, where most of the heads are new, the heads of the figures on the South Wall are mostly original. Some half-dozen figures are recognizable from looking at other surviving statues of members of the imperial family. Nevertheless, much debate has taken place over many of these figures, including Augustus, Agrippa, Tiberius, Julia, and Antonia. The figure of Augustus was not discovered until the 1903 excavation, and his head was damaged by the cornerstone of the Renaissance palazzo built on top of the original Ara Pacis site. Although he was identified correctly in 1903, Peterson, Strong, and Stuart Jones initially saw the figure as the Rex Sacrorum. Today Augustus is better recognized by his hairstyle than his face. In the absence of Augustus from the panel, early scholars debated whether this figure was Augustus or Agrippa or Lepidus. In 1907, Savking proposed that this figure was Lepidus, the Pontifex Maximus at the time. Savking later reversed his position with a series of peculiar suggestions. In 1926, Loewy compared the Louvre Agrippa of the Agrippa in Copenhagen to the Ara Pacis in order to demonstrate iconographical similarity. Aside from a very small minority of scholars, the rest of the Academy concluded that this figure is Agrippa. Ryberg's 1949 article gave further weight to that conclusion. Many scholars continue to see the Julia figure as Livia, having reasoned that Livia has to be on the Ara Pacis. Indeed, Livia does appear somewhere, but by 13 BC Julia had politically eclipsed Livia, as has been understood and explained by many scholars. The identification dates back to Milani in 1891. Furthermore, Livia has no bond to Agrippa, whereas Julia was his wife and expected to be the unofficial empress of Rome for decades, during and beyond Augustus' lifetime. Julia also better personified Augustus' new pronatalism program, having already given birth to 4 surviving children. Nevertheless, a majority of scholars in 2000 preferred to see this figure as Livia. The Tiberius figure was identified as such by Milani, an identification that was rarely questioned until the 1940s. Moretti, in making a glass museum for the Ara Pacis at Mussolini's command, guessed that the 2 consuls of 13 flank Augustus. So he saw this figure as M. Valerius Messala, V.H. von Poulsen and Toynbee proposed Iulus Antonius. But as has been well established, Augustus is flanked by priests, and this figure is Tiberius. Boschung and Bonanno had both matched the face to early-period Tiberius statuary. In relation to Antonia, Drusus, and Germanicus, Duchka proposed in 1880 the correct identity for Antonia and Drusus, but incorrectly saw the toddler as Claudius. A. von Domaszewski amended this family identification and correctly saw the child as Germanicus. He also suggested that the Ara Pacis is arranged in family groups. He also correctly determined that the 2-year-old child could be only Germantius, whose exact birth in the 24th of May 15 BC is known. This helps prove that the ceremony is an event in 13, although a few scholars continue to argue the ceremony was that of 09 BC. In relation to the Domiti Iohanno-Barbi, von Domaszewski also proposed in the same 1903 article that the last family on the south wall is that of the father of the Emperor Nero. The identification remains widespread today. Pollini provides the best summary of this viewpoint in his article, Iohanno-Barbi, a Pareri and some others on the Ara Pacis, where he points out that the writer Suetonius specifically mentions that Nero's father went to the east on the staff of the young Gaius Caesar. As this campaign is known to have begun in 02 BC, it means that Aeneas must have been of mature age by that time, therefore requiring a birth year of at least 17 BC, which would, in turn, make him sufficiently old to be the boy on the Ara Pacis. Pollini also reasons that the delay in Aeneas' career resulted from his documented unpleasant character and points out that the careers of other members of the family with undesirable traits also suffered similar delays. Notably Augustus' youngest grandson, Agrippa Posthumus, who had no career, and Germanicus a brother, the later emperor, Claudius, whose career started late. However, there are some dissenters from this theory. Stern claims that these figures cannot possibly be the Domiti Iohanno-Barbi, on the basis of the belief that Aeneas Domitius Iohanno-Barbus, whom von Domaszewski saw as the boy of the family, was born after the monument's completion. Syme had also argued that Aeneas was born after the monument's completion, but accepted the identification of the Iohanno-Barbus family. preferring to identify the boy as an otherwise unknown elder brother and the girl figure as an otherwise unknown elder sister of Aeneas, both of whom died young. Syme also proved somewhat unintentionally, based on the inscription 6095 Israeli new shekels, that Lucius Domitius Aheno Barbus was governor of Africa in 13 BC and could not be in Rome for the Ara Pacis ceremony. Starting in 1894, Eugen Peterson suggested that Lucius Caesar appears with Agrippa, dressed in a Trojan costume for the equestrian event called the Troy Game, which was held in 13 BC for the dedication of the theatre of Marcellus. This theory won universal acceptance for many decades, even though the evidence is overwhelmingly against. The only early challenge was slight. Several scholars, noting the size and age of the boy beside Agrippa, preferred to identify him as Gaius, an opinion that prevailed by 1935. The boy is clearly not a Roman, given his clothing, lack of bulla, and hair. So ingrained was Peterson's theory, however, that where the distinguished scholar Erica Simon suggested the boy is a barbarian, she was subjected to intense criticism until she retreated, once called her opinion perfect nonsense. Subsequently, led by Charles Bryan Rose, scholars have realized Peterson was wrong. The boy is a foreign prince. Stern adds the costume is wrong for a Trojan and no bulla, worn by all Roman boys as protection from the evil eye. Many others have contributed to disprove Peterson's theory.